And we are proceeding to our second speaker. I'm happy to welcome Maxim Shrayer. Maxim Shrayer received his PhD at Yale University in 1995. He's now professor of Russian, English and Jewish studies at Boston College. Among his many publications, I want to mention his book series, Jews of Russia and Eastern Europe and Their Legacy, which appears at Academic Studies Press, as well as his literary memoir, Waiting for America, A Story of Immigration, Leaving Russian, short story, which was published in 2013, and finally, of course, his two-volume anthology of Jewish Russian literature. Today, he's going to talk on Boris Pasternak, the creation of apostasy. So, Maxim, please.
עמיתים יקרים, אני שמח מאוד לחזור לאוניברסיטת בר-אילן, שם יש לי חברים רבים. ברצוני להודות לפרופסור ריינר ולפרופסור טרפיץ, אז חכמתם נדיבה. אני מתנצל על העברית שלי, אבל תאמין שהמטבע הרוסית עוד יותר גרוע כשאני מדבר איטלקית. It's true. When I speak Italian, the Russian accent just comes through. It's like I don't know where it comes through. But so in any case, please forgive that, but I'm working on it. And please allow me to begin with some personal comments, and when I'm finished with those, I will have most likely run out of time. And I want to start by saying that some of you know that I've been writing this talk for exactly 25 years. The topic initially reflected my bewilderment as an anthologist of Jewish Russian literature. There was never any doubt in my mind that Pasternak must be represented among some 130 Jewish Russian authors included in the two-volume anthology, and also, for that matter, subsequently featured in the more selective volume. As I combed through Pasternak's texts, I found that Jewish and Judaic vestiges were conspicuously absent in his shorter poetry, particularly the poetry of the 1920s and 30s, on which his reputation as a poet is largely based, perhaps with two or three exceptions. Among Pasternak's epic and narrative poems, only Spiktorsky faintly acknowledges the origins of its half-Jewish protagonist. Among Pasternak's prosaic works predating Dr. Zhivago, there is the early Apellesova Черта, the mark of Apelles, set in Ferrara in Pasternak's time and featuring a poet by the name of Heinrich Heine. When asked if he is related, Pasternak's fictional Heine replies, not at all, a chance coincidence, an unfortunate one. Then there are the Marburg episodes of Safety Conduct, where Pasternak conjures up an image of the great neo-Kantian philosopher Hermann Cohen, and then tells us about his own decision not to become Cohen's disciple. And finally, we're still talking about the pre-Zhivago years, finally there is the Povest, the tale, published in 1929 and complementing Spiktorsky, while also filling out with action many of its gaps and lacunae. That's pretty much it until the wartime years, from which I chose two poems. This in turn brings us to Dr. Zhivago, in which, as Pasternak himself wrote in the famous letter to Olga Fredenberg, dated October 13th, 1946, I settle scores with Jewry, s еврейством, which of course could also be alternatively translated as Jewishness, with all kinds of nationalism, also the ones disguised as internationalism, with all shades of anti-Christianity. The selection of Jewish excerpts from Dr. Zhivago was both straightforward and less so. There are two main statements in the novel. The first, of course, from the beginning, describes Misha Gordon's journey from Moscow, in the course of which he witnesses the suicide of Yuri Zhivago's father. The second, which takes place in Galicia in the summer of 1915, depicts Gordon's visit to the Eastern Front, where Zhivago is serving as a military doctor. Then, as you remember, Zhivago protects a Jew from the mockery by a Cossack, and on the heels of that, Misha Gordon unleashes his famous monologue in which he talks about the way Jews must convert and cease to be Jewish. This is the very section about which, as Professor Roman Katzman brilliantly demonstrated, many an Israeli intellectual of the late 1950s and 60s had a strong opinion, whether or not some of them actually read the entire novel. So I ended up including two poems from the 1940s, which by most critical accounts are considered minor, and two excerpts from the novel Dr. Zhivago. What, I kept asking myself, is one to make of Pasternak's continuous and virtual literary silence about his Jewishness throughout the 19-teens, 1930s, followed by a hushed, coded response to the Shoah in wartime poems, which in turn was followed by an explosion of passionate apostatic commentary in Dr. Zhivago, a commentary which, like a lamprey, leads a life of its own on the surface of the novel. Now comes a shift from the mode of memoristic self-reflection to that of an elegy not forbidding mourning. I'm 2 weeks away from the first yahrzeit of my father, the writer, medical scientist, and refusnik activist David Shrayer Prof, Zichrano Livracha, who died in Boston on June 9, 2024. I mention this because back in 2012, my father and I both spoke here in Bar-Ilan at a wonderful symposium that Roman Katzman and Ber Kotlerman organized at a panel with Chava Pinkas Cohen, Miriam Anisimov, Gilles Rosier, David Markish, and Ber Kerler. It was a great event, and there are several colleagues in this audience who knew my father, who wrote about him and translated his poetry into Hebrew and Yiddish. I'm therefore compelled to share a reflection that dovetails with the topic of my presentation. In our Moscow apartment, 3 portraits adorned my father's den. There was the drawing of young Pasternak by his father, Leonid Pasternak. This is the famous portrait of 1923. Pasternak is 33. He is a 33-year-old Russian Jew with roots in Odessa, and here he looks very much like his Sephardic ancestors. There were also photographs of a forlorn, silver-bearded Ernest Hemingway clad in a fisherman's sweater, and a half-smiling Robert Frost sporting a herringbone coat and a wool scarf. My father heard Frost live in Leningrad in 1962, and to the end of his life he remembered the towering stranger who, for my father, betokened the openness and expansiveness of American culture rather than the narrowness or xenophobia now getting the upper hand in the American mainstream. Frost was a beaming light of American Anglo-Saxon liberalism. It was much more complicated with the legacies of Hemingway and Pasternak. In the 1950s, Pasternak the poet was one of my father's literary idols. In a poem of 1956, composed after the 20th Congress and Khrushchev's anti-Stalinist speech, but never published prior to our emigration in 1987, my father challenged fellow poets, many of them young Soviet Jews on the Leningrad poetry scene, Evgeny Rein, Alexander Kushner, and others, to practice a new version of Pasternak's verbal rebellion. Но вырвусь я из рыжего рая и крикну трусливым знаком: составьте стих, как псы умирают, как я люблю Пастернака, which literally means, but I will wrest myself from the red-haired paradise and scream out to the cowardly signs, compose verse the way dogs meet their death, the way I love Pasternak. It pained my father, and especially during the visits to Peredelkina, to see members of the Jewish Soviet intelligentsia emulate not Pasternak's poetic achievements, but his message of a total, final Jewish assimilation. In the 1960s, my father was drawn to the unapologetically Jewish poet and Shoah witness Ilya Sylvinsky. But Pasternak, despite his mythologized Christianity, was hors concours. I felt it clearly as a child. This is partly eyewitness testimony. And so years later, when I was already an American academic and a student of Jewish Russian literature, I chose to tread carefully when my father and I discussed Pasternak. In December 2011, I first traveled to Crimea to conduct research about the murder of Ashkenazi Jews and Krimchaks and what Ilya Silvinsky had witnessed in early January of 1942. The trip changed my life. A year later, in December 2012, when my father and I both traveled to Israel and spoke here at Bar-Ilan, I pushed my father on the subject of Misha Gordon's programmatic statement in Dr. Zhivago, which reads, "Don't hold on to your identity, don't stick together, disperse, be with all the rest. You are the very thing against which you have been turned by the worst and weakest among you." I remember saying to my father something along the lines of this: what a grave lack of understanding of Jewishness, and what a lifeless view of Judaism as a parochial exclusionist theology. After what I saw outside Kerch, the ditch, Jewish bones lying there under a thin layer of soil and feathergrass, I can no longer take this. On numerous occasions, my father had written against the apostasy of Soviet Jews as a sociocultural phenomenon of the 1960s and 1970s, and yet his response to the apathetic message of Pasternak's novel was ontologically kindred to his response to Hemingway's anti-Semitism. I read Dr. Zhivago as a fictional biography of a Russian doctor. My father told me as we both drank Café Afuch at a little place just outside the campus perimeter here at Bar-Ilan. I think Roma Kosman remembers this. Both Pasternak and Hemingway were my father's youthful loves. I thought a lot about it in the month following his passing, and I came to see that he never unloved them, even during the Refusenik years of being ostracized as a Jewish writer and activist, and despite his growing repudiation of both Pasternak's Jewish religious apostasy and Hemingway's American anti-Jewish prejudice. Grief has changed something in my own understanding. And here is what it has changed. To this day, the debates about Pasternak, both in post-Soviet Russia and in the West, have not dispensed of the dilemma of possession and belonging. Who wants to own Pasternak and who wishes to disown him? Russian Orthodox theologians continue to exalt Pasternak's religious beliefs on the basis of his self-styled mythology of an illicit childhood baptism, his knowledge of gospel texts and Russian Orthodox prayers, and his church-going during the last 2 decades of his life. Is it possible to move beyond either trying to prove what a complex and forward-looking Christian Pasternak was, or what kind of a bad Jew he was? Is it not possible to read Pasternak's texts, Zhivago, first and foremost, without judging either his life as a Jew or his life as a Christian? Incidentally, and I say this because I've spent many years thinking about Vladimir Nabokov, who had a Jewish wife and son and had known Nazism firsthand, was really well ahead of the critical curve. He admired Pasternak's early poetry and resented his apostasy. And yet, in his judgment of Dr. Zhivago, he emphasized that the novel was, quote, melodramatic and vilely written, and dubbed it Dr. Mrtvago, derived not from the Russian root for life, but from the Russian root for death. Now, what follows is a very brief examination of Pasternak's poetry of the 1940s. Why the 1940s? This is, by the way, a chronically unexamined period. The 1940s, both wartime and post-war, encompassing the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, the Shoah by bullet and the final solution, the devastation of Jewish life in much of Eastern Europe, but also the transformation of Zhdanovщина and the anti-cosmopolitan campaign into an onslaught against Jewish culture and identity in the USSR. And finally, the formation of the State of Israel were the most productive period in Pasternak's creation of apostasy. The creation of apostasy is my own term that I'm hoping to advance today, but also in something that I hopefully will have finished. The Nazi invasion found Pasternak in Peredelkino, outside Moscow. Pasternak could have become a voice of resistance and anti-Nazism, a voice simultaneously Russian, Soviet, and Jewish. Instead, he was searching for a different modality. In a diary entry from 1941, Ilya Ehrenburg wrote about Pasternak, madness. Evacuated to Chistopol in Tatarstan in October 1941, and this is the famous picture from Chistopol, where, of course, Silvinsky is on furlough. He's already a lieutenant colonel. He has spent almost a year at the battlefronts, and Pasternak looks very bewildered because he has not so much tasted of the frontline areas or the front. So he is evacuated with a group of prominent Soviet writers, and he contributed only a few poems, most of them suffused with pressurized Russian patriotism. In July 1943, prior to the start of the Battle of Kursk, he returned to Moscow, and then in August and early September 1943, Pasternak traveled to then the recently liberated Oryol area with a group of writers. Don't be fooled by the uniform. This was common practice for Soviet writers who traveled embedded with the troops, but who were not actually military journalists or political officers, to wear the uniforms, usually of privates. So he was not actually a member of the military. In any case, a survey of Pasternak's wartime poetry reveals two main interconnected tendencies that enter his lyrical poetry in 1941-42 as Pasternak undertakes to write about the war. The use of gospel and Russian Orthodox imagery and the linkage of Slavophilic views of Russian history with the wartime Stalinist rhetoric on nationhood. The poem Stary Park, the Old Park, dated 1941, is the poem in which Pasternak turned for inspiration to the history of Peredelkino outside Moscow. Of course, you know that Peredelkino was developed in 1934 as a writer's resort area in a previously forested area located between two villages, Izmalkovo and Lukino. It so happens that one of them, with its large park and manor house, had once been the part of the estate of Yuri Samarin, a friend and disciple of Alexei Khomykov, one of the leaders of the Slavophile intellectual movement. And so in the poem, Pasternak conjures up the image of a contemporary, Samarin's great-grandson, whom the poet charges with a mission. Если только хватит силы, он как дед-энтузиаст, прадеда славянофила пересмотрит и издаст. If only there's enough strength, he, an enthusiast like his grandfather, will reconsider, or perhaps will revise and publish his Slavophile great-grandfather. This descendant of the Slavophile Samarin, actually a kind of wishful alter ego of Pasternak himself, Russified and provincialized and inscribed into Russia's history, is said to be contemplating a play inspired by the war. And in fact, the description of the play adumbrates Pasternak's own attempt to create a Russocentric and patriotic play about the Nazi-Soviet war, which he never completed. And as the late Omri Ranen, who was my father's cousin, his mother was a Shrayer, showed in a very fine article, this play was modeled after Leonid Leonov's play, because Pasternak and Leonov were very tight during the time they were both evacuated to Tatarstan. More specifically, Pasternak's use of Russian Orthodox imagery was notable in several poems, such as the lines «На улице светло, как в храмине, и вид ее неузнаваем». The street is bright like the inside of a church and looks unrecognizable. In the introduction to the unfinished long poem Zarevo, Fire Glow, printed in Pravda on the 15th October 1943, but it's nowhere as deliberate and as central to the design of the poem as in Ожившая фреска, Fresco Come Alive, which was published on the 15th of April 1944. So in that poem, during a battle, The land in Pasternak's poem hums like a service of public prayer, земля гудела, как молебен, and tosses smoke and debris like a censer, кадильницей. The poem's hero, a Russian soldier, recalls going to church and clutching his mother's arm as he now imagines himself as an ancient warrior on a fresco coming alive before his eyes. The fresco, in fact, represents St. George's slaughter of the dragon, and the parallel could not be clearer. The Russian soldier defending Russia draws strength from orthodoxy and centuries-old religious iconography. Now, with 2 or 3 exceptions, Pasternak's wartime poems are among his weakest, in part because they feel too crafty and synthetic. To reiterate what I said earlier, Pasternak's response to the Shoah was nearly absent both in poetry and absent in wartime prose. 2 exceptions were the poems Pasternak wrote on commission, one from the leading newspaper of the Soviet Navy, which were dedicated to the liberation of Odessa and the Black Sea coast between Odessa and Nikolaev. And in those poems, Pasternak paid contorted tribute to his parents, Odessa, and to the victims of the Shoah. One in particular is conspicuous, Pasternak's poem Odessa, which appears under the title Великий день on the 12th of April 1944. This is just 2 days after the liberation of Odessa. We really don't know, I don't think we'll ever find out, how much exactly Pasternak knew of the mass extermination of the Jews in Odessa and Transnistria. What we do know is that stanza 6 of the poem, which metaphorically evokes the faces of murdered Jews, was missing in the original newspaper publication. In stanza 6, Pasternak used the botanical term immortel, which is the one that corresponds to the Latin helichrysum, and also known as curry plant. Pasternak opts for the foreign immortel over the native Russian бессмертник, which would have been just fine. Бессмертник, literally a deathless one, an immortal one, which to a native speaker's ear would invoke death and immortality much more prominently than the French immortel. The immortelles, the flowers of immortality, growing over the mass execution pits, here evoke the tens of thousands of Jewish victims of the Shoah murdered in Odessa and its environs. Ecclesiastical notes are audible in this poem, and in line 3 of stanza 1, Pasternak had as a variant победитель, victor, but then he settled for избавитель, rescuer, which also suggests savior. What is more, Pasternak unequivocally identifies the rescuers as Russian, the русский гул, веселый, merry Russian humming, in stanza 3. Finally, the last stanza issues a promise to the widows and relatives of the victims. With all our Russian ingenuity, we swear, inspired by the great event, to build the martyrs in perpetuity a worthy peacetime monument. Русский гений is both the Russian ingenuity and the Russian genius of Pasternak's earlier 1941 poem of the same title. And so this is most intriguing, and I guess it already signals Pasternak's brimming with Dr. Zhivago. And I'm almost finished. With interruptions, Pasternak worked on Dr. Zhivago in 1946-1955. I will not have time to extend these observations of Pasternak's wartime poetry to the novel. I will only point out that in the post-Shoah Soviet 1940s and early 50s, Pasternak had finalized his creation of Apostasy, a creation which is both a flawed artistic text and a warped cultural myth, which, as Jung teaches us, both obfuscates and compensates. Over the year since my father's death, a different understanding of Boris Pasternak has crystallized for me. Pasternak was a brainchild of the Russian Silver Age. We all know that. But what is important is that in his life and oeuvre, both his life and his work offer one of the most fully embodied versions of the Silver Age concepts of жизнестроительства, life building, and жизнетворчества, life creation. In Pasternak's case, efforts to separate his lived life of a Russian and Soviet Jew and his textualized living experience as a self-styled Russian Orthodox Christian are particularly problematic. In his literary memoir, Safety Conduct, Охранная грамота, Pasternak eulogized Vladimir Mayakovsky, who had killed himself in 1930. I quote, "And all this was so simple. Art was called tragedy, as art should be called. The name of the tragedy was Vladimir Mayakovsky. The title concealed a brilliantly simple discovery that the poet is not the author, but the subject of the lyrical verse, who addresses the world in first person. The title was not the first name of the author, but the last name of the content." What Pasternak said about Mayakovsky applies much more fully to his own career. His path to Dr. Zhivago was one of a Jew's creation of the literary life of a Christian. A poet by God's grace, Pasternak was a supreme Russian artist of Jewish religious apostasy. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this fascinating as much as personal talk. And we have now some minutes for comments and discussions.
How do we get this on the screen? Is that the real thing? Okay. Olaf, just hang on 1 second. We have a technical interlude here. Okay? They're trying to get this on the screen. But you look great, Olaf.
Thanks.
All right.
Okay, so if there are questions from the audience on site? So, perhaps a first question from me. I was wondering, when you showed us the poem Odessa from 44, in one line he writes, "Мы вечный памятник построим." I mean, this is Soviet diction, right? I mean, this is always the eternal memorial without any nationality. So that's concerns, but also other nationalities, right? So it's Soviet.
You're absolutely correct, which is why I said that it's simultaneously suffused with a pressurized version of Stalinist new great Russian imperial chauvinism and with Orthodox imagery. That's, I guess, the greatest paradox of that his path was not one of simply investing these poems with Russian Orthodox imagery, but also was trying to marry those to what had emerged, particularly after 1943, when Stalin reopens the churches, as perhaps a return to a kind of imperial Russian chauvinism with an Orthodox twist. But oddly enough, of course, Pasternak had miscalculated on that matter. But we're not talking about the calculation. We're talking about the poems he wrote. Yeah, thanks, Olaf.
And maybe a second question, and then there's the room.
There is a question from the audience. Olaf, may we bring the person? Yes, Ola, you're going to have to come here. I hate to do this, but... What?
I was curious how you were reading of this Jewish apostasy squares up with this idea by, I think, Judith Kornbluth, doubly chosen, or if it how does it work with that?
It honestly doesn't.
Right. So that's.
So I don't really have anything to say, Olga. I'm really sorry, because it would be a comment on a book that is specifically about a trend that basically starts in the 1960s and culminates in the 1980s, when members of Jewish Soviet intelligentsia were, in part, after the very, very captivating example of people like Father Alexander Min, were becoming Orthodox Christians. What is, of course, not untrue is that, and I mentioned this, that they thought that they were emulating Pasternak, but it was actually very much, in my view, a misreading of Pasternak. But Judith Kornblut's book is a kind of sociological study based on in-depth interviews of the people, some of them later who came to America and to Israel. And the idea of doubly chosen, well, I don't know. I don't have a polite way of describing it. It poisoned the minds of about 5,000 to 6,000 Soviet Jews, in my estimation, members of the intelligentsia, who became convinced that they were actually remaining Jews while becoming, or precisely because they were becoming Christians. But honestly, my talk has very little to do with that, as you can see. Right.
Essentially, you disagree with that, so you say
Look, I'm not a theologian. I don't feel that I am in the position to disagree theologically with this idea, but as someone who has studied it as a cultural phenomenon, I find it deeply problematic and flawed. Right? That's what I guess I would say. But I think we would really not be serving the audience well, because you would have to really get into the thick of Kornblut's argument, not, what my reading of Pasternak. Yeah. Raman. Do you want to come here?
Do you track today's tendencies in Slavic circles about this?
Roma, you're in trouble now.
You have to go there, they don't hear.
Be a star for one moment.
Thank you very much. Do you track today's tendencies in the circles of Slavists concerning this question of Pasternak?
Well, so, look,
Repeat the question.
I think, no, Raman's question was whether in sort of the present-day studies of Pasternak still reveal these tendencies. And I think, to put it very simply, I think Pasternak's studies are still caught in the doubly vicious circle of A, trying to figure out what kind of Jew, usually bad, and what kind of Christian, usually model, forward-looking Pasternak was, and of trying to deal with his relationship with Stalin. And unfortunately, I feel like, some of the greatest Pasternak scholars are still engaged in those performances. And I'm in no way a great Pasternak scholar, but as you can understand, Raman, I'm trying to move beyond value judgments of Pasternak's Jewishness or Christianity. And what I'm arguing for is that it's a textual phenomenon. It's a textual creation of apostasy. It is not a religious or social practice. That's what I am trying to do here. Good. Thank you so much.
I think Olaf had another question.
Oh, but aren't we out of time?
Sort of, yeah.
Olaf, you decide.
Well, we have time for one more short question.
Yeah.
I thought in the audience there's somebody asking.
No, you had.
You had one, Olaf. I think that we're good here.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether he was in any way in contact with Grossman and Ehrenburg, or had any idea about their project.
Pasternak. So he was certainly in contact with Ehrenburg, much more so than Grossman. And the famous anecdote is that Pasternak refuses to speak at now the legendary rally of Jewish intelligentsia in Moscow, at which Ehrenburg reads his famous essay in which he argues that the Nazis remind us of the fact that we are Jews a little bit. With Grossman, less so. But there is a very interesting article by the late Leonid Katzis, who spoke on many symposia here of blessed memory, where he actually tries to read Zhivago and Grossman's epic novels, eventually leading up to Life and Fate, Жизнь и судьба, in a comparative fashion. And I find it quite productive, believe it or not. And of course, Grossman's opinion of the novel was quite negative. That's a well-known fact. So, thank you so much.